Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Graff and I'm Vice President of Comparative Effectiveness Research with the National Pharmaceutical Council. I'm pleased to be here today talking about Let's Get Real, about how the FDA real-world framework for real-world evidence will impact you. So let's talk about what we'll address today. On today's webinar, you'll learn a bit more about NPC's engagement on real-world evidence. Because we have a number of webinar participants with a variety of expertise and experience with real-world evidence, we'll provide a ground-setting stage for the overview of FDA's current use of real-world evidence and the recently released framework for FDA's RWE program. We're joined by a set of experts from the patient community, from the payer community, and the industry perspective to discuss how real-world evidence is being used and how FDA's new guidance may affect them. We'll move into panel discussion and then we'll reach out to you, the webinar participants, for questions and answers. This is especially timely as we think about last month's U.S. FDA framework that was released on December 6th to discuss how real-world evidence can help support the approval of a new indication for a pre-approved medicine or help satisfy post-approval study requirements. So to help us address this today, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Eleanor Perfetta, who is Executive Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at the National Health Council. Her policy research focuses on patient engagement in healthcare, including comparative effectiveness, patient-centered outcomes research, medical product development, value assessment, patient-reported outcomes, and a variety of other activities. In addition to her role at National Health Council, she also holds part-time faculty appointment at the University of Maryland, where she's Professor of Pharmaceutical Health Services. Thank you for joining us today, Eleanor. We have Brandy Yates, who is Senior Director of the Center of Expertise in Global Patient Outcomes and Real-World Evidence at Eli Lilly and Company. At Lilly, she leads and develops the research talent and capabilities needed to provide scientific services and expertise, and supports the health economics and outcomes research area of focus, which includes both observational studies and real-world evidence. Prior to that role, she had much experience leading risk evaluation and mitigation strategies and working on early and late phase clinical trials. And finally, we have Tricia Lee Wilkins, who's Director of Pharmacy Affairs at the Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy, where she develops strategies and initiatives to demonstrate the value of managed care pharmacy services and models of care. Tricia Lee brings a wealth of experience from her time as pharmacy advisor and health IT specialist with the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology, where she led health IT standards initiatives and advised on regulatory processes. These are all really critical as we think about what data is available and how we can use it for real-world evidence. So with that as an overview, let's get started. The title for today's webinar is Let's Get Real. How will real-world evidence impact you? At my house and growing up, one of the things that we often thought about and we saw was Sesame Street shows. There's a character, Big Bird, and he has this special friend, Mr. Snuffleupagus. Now, Snuffy was never seen by any of the adults. And whenever something couldn't be explained, and Big Bird would say, well, Mr. Snuffleupagus did it, most of the rest of the characters on Sesame Street didn't believe him. They thought he wasn't real. Now, this isn't just a small animal. He's a large animal. He left a lot of evidence around, footprints, tracking devices, etc. But many people still did not believe that he was an important character at Sesame Street and could be trusted. It wasn't until Big Bird invited the rest of the characters over to his nest where they finally saw Mr. Snuffleupagus. This brings us to the point with real-world evidence. In the past, real-world evidence was never really trusted by skeptics. It often wasn't among the highest hierarchies of evidence as people, payers, population decision makers, and patients took various pieces of evidence to inform their decision making. So the question that we have today is, despite the big data, the big evidence that is left due to our interactions with the healthcare system, will people see real-world evidence? Will it be trusted? Or will things like the FDA's new framework on real-world evidence be the catalyst to make it routinely seen and used? Now, why is this important to NPC? Over the past several years, one of our core activities has been focused on ensuring that high-quality evidence is available, accepted, and used to drive decision-making. Our work has focused on trying to ensure that the supply of evidence is truly high quality. We've done this through developing standards, driving towards consensus on these standards for developing good, high-quality, real-world evidence, as well as to better understand what stakeholders think about real-world evidence. What are the facilitators and challenges for them to use this evidence? So we're thrilled to have this discussion today as we think about real-world evidence. So what is real-world evidence? Many of you may have your own definitions, and there are multiple definitions that exist. As the FDA has described in their framework, real-world data sources are electronic health records, insurance claims, patient registries, or digital health applications. Think about every time you go to the doctor's office, you fill a prescription, you see someone at urgent care, speak with a dietitian. These all generate data that are out as we interact with healthcare and the healthcare system. This data then can be collected and used across a variety of sources and is what we'll refer to as real-world data. However, data can just be noise. It takes careful curation, analysis, and work. And that work is really the core of the focus of our discussion today, which is real-world evidence. The curation, the analytics, and analysis to help identify the potential benefits or risks of intervention derived from our interactions with the healthcare system. So let's take a quick look at how the FDA is using real-world evidence to date. A little over a decade, the FDA Mini-Sentinel pilot initiative was launched, and the goal was really to provide real-time monitoring of post-market performance of regulated products using claims databases. This initiative moved from a pilot to Mini-Sentinel to full Sentinel, and now many groups, including the private sector, can also access this by going through applications. But the use of real-world evidence has really focused on the safety. How many patients take the medication? How often does a side effect occur? Does a side effect occur more commonly with one product than with another? All of those things that we want to understand in a very timely manner to address population health. Over the past few years, as we've seen more and more products come to the market for rare diseases, where there's not a lot of patient data, there's a clear unmet need, we've seen additional real-world evidence being used to help provide historical controls or real-world data to help provide a comparison arm when there's just insufficient data for two different arms. An example of this is blinatumomab, which was used as a historical control for acute lymphoblastic leukemia. We've also seen more recently several uses of real-world evidence to contribute to post-marketing commitments. For example, expansion of a label from certain cystic fibrosis mutations to additional cystic fibrosis mutations to address efficacy and safety for patients with those new mutations, or to better understand the long-term efficacy associated with vaccines. Beyond that, use of real-world evidence has been more rare, which brings us to December 2016. Congress passed, and it was signed into law, the 21st Century Cures Act, which requested that FDA identify potential use of real-world evidence to support the approval of a new indication of a drug and to support or satisfy post-approval study requirements. In addition, the 21st Century Cures timeline asked for a framework to be developed by December 2018. And that's what we're talking about here today. Subsequently, FDA must develop draft guidance by 2021 and finalize that subsequently. So what's happened in the past 2 years? There have been a number of conferences, dialogues, and advancements across different stakeholders and public meetings to better identify and understand the potential use of real-world evidence. It's an evolution and an important one, but one that we have more work yet to be done. Now, when 21st Century Cures first came out, there was much excitement about being able to use real-world data sources and real-world evidence to complement, augment, and expand our understanding of how treatments work in the real world. As patients, we want the most of upfront and available information, and so there was much excitement. But at the same time, not everybody agreed that real-world evidence could or should be used. So it brings us to how should it be used, how could it be used, and what are the safeguards that we need to ensure that it is being used appropriately. And FDA has taken that work very seriously. Not only that, they've put their funding requests where the action is. In 2019, fiscal funding request that's yet to be granted, FDA requested $100 million for real-world data enterprise to update and modernize the data collection that is used. Now, this represents a little over 25% of their innovation budget. So this is putting real-world evidence and real-world data collection really a bit on steroids. In addition, on December 6th, they announced the real-world evidence framework. And the top 5 things that I'd like to identify that we see as key elements that you'll want to think about if you have not read it is the important role of expanding the potential use of real-world evidence from safety to address efficacy and effectiveness. This is a change. In the framework, FDA also identifies broader types of real-world data sources that will be considered, including digital health, mobile health, patient-generated information, as well as the traditional data sources we often think about. Claims that are generated when we go to the physician office, prescriptions, labs, and electronic health record information. The third element that is a take-home piece is that it didn't just focus on pragmatic trials or traditional clinical trials using randomized real-world data sources. It also identifies that FDA will be considering how observational studies might be considered, how real-world data sources can be used for control arms for rare and oncology treatments. So it's a broad list of types of studies, not just randomized controlled trials. Addressing many of the critics, FDA outlines the importance of the context for clinical condition. What are the outcomes that are needed? What's the quality of the data? And what decision is being made? So not just all real-world evidence will be considered, context and quality will be of primary interest. The last piece is, in addition to just putting out guidance, FDA announced that they will continue to review existing activities, develop additional guidance, and continue to engage both internally and with external stakeholders. And that's where many of us come in. So with these 5 elements, let's talk a bit more about how the context matters. So FDA outlined a 3-part approach. First, asking, is the real-world data fit for use? What's the relevance? What's the quality of the data? The second is the study or trial design used to generate going to use adequate scientific evidence to help answer the regulatory question? So thinking a lot about the analytic methods, the standards that go into this. And then finally, does the study conduct meet regulatory requirements? As this continues to move forward, we may see additional evolution on this, but this is the framework that FDA has put forward initially. So what decisions will FDA be considering? As noted, real-world evidence has long been used for safety and monitoring. It's also been used to inform modeling and trial design. to help inform pivotal trial design, to help understand who are the patients that are most likely to be at risk. The new decisions that are included in the new FDA framework help to identify, can use real-world evidence to support changes to labeling about drug effectiveness. So, for instance, modifying the indication, a dose regimen, route of administration, adding a new population, such as potentially a different age group, and adding comparative effectiveness or safety information. So it's really quite a broad set of new initiatives that are working across the Food and Drug Administration, across each of the clinical divisions, and across a variety of different functional areas. So while 21st Century Cures initially announced that there would need to be a guidance that would be developed by 2021, FDA in the framework outlined a very comprehensive and multifaceted approach, which includes demonstration projects, many of which are underway, not just one, but multiple guidance documents addressing different elements of study design, data sources, and monitoring. They've also announced that they will continue to engage stakeholders, and they've identified a series of internal steps to ensure that this information makes its way throughout the agency and that they continue to operate against the best standards via an internal website, subcommittee, and other resources to put real-world evidence at the hands of the reviewers. So beyond FDA and real-world evidence, this brings us to the next question. Beyond regulatory decisions, will the FDA and the increased focus on real-world evidence allow it to be more trusted, be seen as real, and used more routinely? So with that, let's go ahead and move on to the panelist discussion. And what each of the panelists will be discussing is how are you and others like you using real-world evidence today? How does the FDA's use of real-world evidence impact your work? And what are the unique considerations for stakeholders such as yourself? So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our first panelist, Dr. Eleanor Perfetto with the National Health Council. Eleanor, take it away.
Thanks, Ben. So thanks very much for this opportunity to be part of this webinar and to talk a little bit more about what the National Health Council has been doing in the area of real-world evidence. For those of you who don't know the National Health Council, we are a not-for-profit organization in Washington, D.C., and the large majority of our membership includes patient advocacy organizations. We're a member organization, and this represents the patient advocacy component of our membership. And you see we have many of the largest organizations and some of the smaller organizations in the country. We represent the 160 million people in the United States who have chronic diseases and disabilities, and we represent them through these organizations. When the 21st Century Cures Act was first passed, and there was this discussion about real-world evidence and what the FDA would be undertaking, we thought it would be important for us to understand what implications this has for the patient community, especially those that we represent. So we began some qualitative research, doing some interviews with some of our members and others, patients out in the community, to ask their reaction to real-world evidence. Do they know what it is? Do they understand it? What do they think of it? Do they think it should be used for regulatory and other kinds of decisions? And the results that we got from that small study, we actually did it twice, so several small studies, was that most people, if you walk up to them on the street, have no idea what real-world evidence is. And we would expect that. But once you explain to them what it is, they actually think that using real-world evidence is a good idea and that it should be used. And when you explain to them how it might be used for regulatory decisions, it's overwhelming that they all reported that it should be used in order to look at some of the new uses that might happen for an existing drug that's already been approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, but that it should not be used to approve something that has not already gone through the formal approval process that the FDA has in place using clinical trial data the way it normally would. And so that actually happened in conjunction with the 21st Century Cures Act coming out at about that time, where people were saying that they pretty much agreed with what was in the Act, even though they didn't really know what was in there. They had never heard of it before, but they did agree that it should be used this way. We then took this information a bit further and decided that we wanted to delve deeper into what did our constituents really need to know about real-world evidence to be able to contribute to it and to be able to use it in their everyday decision-making. Advance the slide, please. So what we did is in 2007, we held a day-long multi-stakeholder roundtable. In the discussion, we had community views on our real-world evidence. We had three main components. It was patient community views on real-world evidence, areas that are of the greatest concern to those patient group participants, and the information and the tools they most need to understand, trust, and use real-world evidence. And the day was broken up into discussions about these three components. I am not going to go into a lot of detail about the methodology that we used and who participated. That information is available on the National Health Council website. We have a brief report on the website that you can take a look at about this roundtable that we had. And then we're also very happy to say that a peer-reviewed publication came out on this, on our findings for this roundtable, and that just came out in the last week in the Journal of the Patient. And so you can find that there, and it will provide a lot more detail to you. I'm going to just give you a brief summary here of what we found. We had several emerging themes. They focused on raising patient community awareness, enhancing patient community capacity, patient-specific uses of real-world evidence, and considering context, that context is important. We were very happy to see that we had this meeting in July of 2017, and this consideration of context came out as a theme, and it also is something that found its way into the FDA document that was released in December. So let's talk a little bit more and drill down a little bit more in raising patient community awareness. As I said earlier, patients have little understanding of the phrase or the term RWE, real-world evidence. But once they understand it and have been explained what it is and the definition, they really are in favor of that kind of data being used for all kinds of decision-making. And the finding that we had was that patient organizations really believe that they have an important role to play in disseminating important insights from real-world evidence. The way that they describe it is that they are very often the arbiters of information that their patient community learns, sometimes through doctors, through the internet, and their constituents turn to them to help them weed through all of this information and help them figure out what's real and what information should they be using and what is really snake oil and how they can differentiate. So they do have an important role to play in communicating RWE to their constituents. We also identified that there was an important component of enhancing patient community capacity to deal with this. One of the things that was talked about was that common standardized definitions of RWD and RWE are vital. Up until this point, very recently with the FDA's document coming out and FDA putting out its definitions, there are multiple definitions out there, lots of definitions that come from different stakeholders. And in order for the patient community to be involved and to build its capacity to engage in this area, they really need to have a common understanding of what the definitions are for real-world data and real-world evidence so that they can contribute and really know what they're talking about as they're engaging. There are various skills and tools that are needed by patient organizations to help facilitate the uptake of real-world evidence, and they cited some of the kinds of tools that they might need in helping them discern high-quality real-world evidence from something that is lower quality that they wouldn't want their constituents to be using. And then they also talked about partnerships with the scientific community to help them differentiate and help them discern the RWE that should be used for decision-making by patients. There were suggestions made such as using their scientific advisory board to help them with these issues, to help them interpret study findings and help them make the differentiation that they might need to make about claims that are made on the internet for something that has no good data behind it versus information that's coming out with good, solid, real-world evidence. And these were the kinds of discussions that they really wanted to see happen more often about how data and information can be translated in a way that the patient community can use it and the groups can disseminate it. There was a discussion about patient-specific uses of real-world evidence, so that it should be used to help inform the decision-making that patients and families have in their healthcare decisions that they have to make. That they need it for clinicians, for their clinicians to be champions for the dissemination and use of real-world evidence. Because if they had clinicians who were not in favor of real-world evidence or were against it or were skeptical of it, it could put them in the dilemma of having information that they thought was sound and rigorous, but having clinicians speak against it. And so they really needed to be able to work with the clinical community to ensure that the clinicians were champions for the data and for the data use and dissemination, and that they would be able to collaborate in helping get that word out there. And they also believe that the communications to patients needs to be balanced and empowering, that needs to be communicated to the people who produce real-world evidence, that they should think about how they would communicate this information to patients in terms of keeping it simple and always being open about addressing the limitations of real-world evidence. And then lastly, consider context, and that the acceptable uses of RWE really need to be linked to the context of its use. Privacy was a very important concern to the patient community, and there's lots of confusion and there are lots of questions whether or not privacy is being adequately protected when real-world evidence gets used, really when the real-world data is out there being used and shared, and that data ownership is clear, and that these things would promote trust when the protections and ownership issues are transparent. And there was an interesting comment that came from one of the participants who, when we were talking about real-world evidence, they made the statement that there should be authentic sources of patient data in real-world evidence. And we said, what do you mean by authentic? And they said, well, we've been talking about these databases, claims databases, EHRs, as being sources of real-world data. Well, those aren't authentic sources of information that comes from patients. Patients are the authentic sources. And so if you really want information about symptoms, about quality of life, about function, you really have to go to the patients to get that, what they believed was really the authentic real-world data, because it comes from real patients. For future directions, what we're doing here at the Council is we're making investments in capacity building and tools. So we want to be able to provide some of those tools that the group was asking for and help them with that capacity building. And right now we have a new project that's just getting off the ground, and it's looking at research methods and good practice principles on how and at which stage of study design patient-provided information should be used by researchers to help inform real-world study designs so that they are more patient-centered in their approach and they are using some patient-provided information in those approaches. And I will stop there and wait for questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Eleanor. So what we heard was, one of my key takeaways is that it's authentic sources of patient data to help inform those decisions. The next question I have is for Tricia Lee, which is, what are those authentic sources of data that payers, health plans, PBMs are hoping to see, and how are they using it today? So with that, let's turn it over to Tricia Lee.
Thank you, Jen. The Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy is the nation's leading professional association dedicated to increasing patient access to affordable medicines, improving health outcomes, and ensuring the wise use of healthcare dollars. Through evidence and value-based strategies and practices, the Academy's nearly 8,000 pharmacists, physicians, nurses, and other practitioners manage medication therapies for 270 million Americans served by health plans, pharmacy benefit management firms, and emerging care models. Last year, we celebrated our 30th anniversary, And if we all think back on where the industry was 30 years ago, we can all agree we've come a long way. We can also agree this is an exciting time for all of us. Technological advancements and the availability of new data sources provide new insights that would otherwise remain unknown or would have taken years to collect and analyze. So our mission and our goal is to advance the profession's knowledge, improve the design and delivery of pharmacy benefits, and ultimately to improve patient satisfaction and their associated health outcomes. As we prepare for the next generation of care, real-world evidence will play a greater role in how our members manage the benefits of populations and no doubt individual patients as well. In the next several slides, I'll share more about the work the Academy and our members are doing to use real-world evidence. I'll share some thoughts on how the FDA framework may impact coverage and payment decisions, and how we all have a role to play in supporting generation and use of real-world evidence. The first publication of AMCP's format for formulary submission was in October of 2000, and currently we're on version 4.0. The evidence requirements outlined in AMCP format are intended for use by manufacturers responding to unsolicited requests from healthcare decision makers to support coverage, reimbursement, and other formulary placement or policies for drugs, tests, devices, or even for classes of drugs as well. The format can be used to synthesize and organize that clinical evidence into a concise document, but we also require that economic models and projections of product impact for the organization are also included. The submission of information in the recommended format does not guarantee approval of the product for formulary listing, but it does, however, allow the manufacturers to communicate the value of a product grounded in evidence-based medicine. It also can be used as a way to kind of complement the healthcare decision maker's own literature and evidence review process. So relating to the formulary, there's 2 points that we can think about for the format and real-world evidence. So certainly for the format, the dossier can be reviewed and updated when there are significant changes. Example, if we know there are changes to the prescribing information, new safety information, anything that materially impacts the overall evidence. While most healthcare decision makers request a dossier for their products when it's newly approved, it can also be used beyond that approval for subsequent class reviews or other times when there might be times where the research design or other evidence suggests that there could be a change in potentially the population of use or other safety implications. While the AMC format does not require manufacturers to use any particular research design or present evidence of benefit, harms, or cost effectiveness, it does strongly recommend that manufacturers include evidence from comparative effectiveness research and real-world data as they become available. So we do encourage the inclusion of real-world evidence as available. The second point is that we really think the FDA's framework is going to be useful. So while AMCP's format does not specifically specify methods for assessing clinical benefit, harms, or economic impact, the evidence presented should meet acceptable standards for health technology assessment, for research, and for quality standards. The FDA framework for real-world evidence states that their program is going to include plans to assess the reliability and relevance of real-world data from medical claims and from EHRs, and that we can use that to figure out how we can use real-world evidence for to evaluate drug product effectiveness. So kind of in summary, whereas the format includes real-world evidence, it excludes standards for evaluating that real-world evidence. We'll hear in the next slide that this is really something healthcare decision makers really need in order to incorporate real-world evidence in their review process. So we really expect that FDA's real-world evidence framework is going to help meet that need in figuring out the quality of that real-world evidence. We should all be familiar with the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee, or P&T Committee. They promote safe and effective drug therapies. They do that by developing policies regarding drug evaluation, selection, and utilization. They can educate practitioners on drugs and appropriate drug utilization. You can imagine that you can find health P&T committees at hospitals, health plans, PBMs, and in other places. They tend to meet regularly, and their actions can include things like educational programs, reviewing drug utilization criteria. They develop a host of policies and certainly, making those decisions on formulary placement. The factors that they consider are primarily clinical efficacy, safety, therapeutic need, clinical guidelines, standards of medical practice, costs, other pharmacoeconomic parameters. While we do know that healthcare decision makers believe real-world data is important and can be used to inform P&T decisions, there's a recent article that was published in the Journal of Managed Care and Specialty Pharmacy that sought to actually quantify the use of real-world evidence by P&T committees. In that study, researchers examined the information cited in 27 reviews of single products or therapeutic classes to inform pharmacy and therapeutic committee recommendations at 6 health plans. Among the 565 references cited, real-world evidence studies comprised only 4% of all references. It worked out to about 21 references that were included by only 2 of those 6 health plans. When the studies were used, however, they were found to be of high quality, and they determined that based on a validity checklist that they went through to determine the quality of the evidence. So what this tells us is that despite the greater availability of real-world evidence, payers most commonly, they're still using clinical studies provided by manufacturers. And the researchers suggested several reasons for that. Primarily, real-world evidence may not be available at the time of approval when the P&T committee is meeting. There may also still be bias towards real-world evidence and real-world data, lack of familiarity with using those types of information, and certainly a higher level of comfort with traditional clinical trials, and also potentially limited staff time to search for additional evidence other than what's included in the label or what might be readily available. We expect that if high-quality real-world evidence is available at the time of approval, that it could be incorporated as a part of those decision process. So how do we address the obvious question? Will the real-world evidence standards used for payment and coverage be similar to or different from the standards used for regulatory decisions? Here's a clear opportunity here for the FDA, but they also need to minimize concerns of over-regulating in a space that's supposed to reflect reality. We like the idea of standards for evaluating real-world evidence and incorporating them into the regulatory process because it gives us all mileposts to ground rules to work from. However, we know there will need to be room for flexibility in the marketplace. And I think we can all agree that 15 competing standards is not ideal. So how about one really thick standard with 14 chapters? I think time will tell on this one, but here are some thoughts on how healthcare decision makers can be impacted. First, it's clear that healthcare decision makers and the FDA have the same goal. Safety and efficacy will remain the first consideration for regulatory and coverage decisions. But what about effectiveness? FDA has stated that its use of real-world data has primarily been around evaluating safety, and only in limited circumstances they've used it to look at effectiveness. Now, through this framework, they're planning to include a focus on regulatory decisions based on effectiveness as well. Specifically, they've mentioned supporting changes to labels based on drug product effectiveness, including adding or modifying the indication, changing the dose, the route, the regimen, or even adding new populations. There's no indication that healthcare decision makers will change the way they approach initial coverage decisions and how they work with the evidence they have at hand. However, the availability of high-quality, reliable real-world data will be useful for subsequent formulary decisions or other types of policy changes. Second, in order for manufacturers to submit real-world data for FDA evaluation, the FDA framework calls for the use of appropriate data standards, specifying how the data is structured, defined, formatted, and exchanged within and between computer systems. FDA suggests a common data model which is used in healthcare to specify terminologies and vocabularies to be used as well. Here's where we can expect huge opportunities and challenges for the use of real-world data. As payers and healthcare decision makers roll out more value-based payment models with outcomes-based contracts, they will need standard measures by which to determine payment and reimbursement. As a place to start, it would simplify the process of executing a value-based contract if products came with some population-specific measures of effectiveness, in which case the FDA and subsequently manufacturers should adopt real-world data standards used in everyday clinic settings, such as ICD, LOINC, SNOMED, or RX norm. These will be the sources of outcome data that are used in these contracts anyway. It will only complicate things if the FDA adopts real-world data standards that don't align with real-world healthcare. The good news is that the FDA doesn't need to reinvent the wheel here. The National Library of Medicine, standards development organizations, and others have done much to develop terminologies and data standards that can be used across healthcare, and CMS has done much to require their use. The challenges to interoperability remain, but adoption of a common data model and structured data by the FDA and manufacturers will go far to promote the ultimate goal of a learning health system. At the end of the day, the applications for real-world data and real-world evidence is much bigger than product approvals and coverage decisions. With the right infrastructure, incentives, and data integration, we can develop an intelligent care delivery system, one that merges healthcare delivery with research, data science, and quality improvement processes, all to tailor care and discoveries to specific patient needs. The managed care community is most familiar with the Sentinel initiative that Jen described, but this is just the beginning. Real-world evidence will drive change for populations and individuals. Fundamentally, payers are thinking beyond product launch and initial coverage decisions to interventions for patients and populations. We believe real-world data will bridge the gap for payers and healthcare decision makers to drive population health management and personalized medicine once that real-world data is unlocked and interpreted appropriately. It's the natural progression from translational medicine. Real-world evidence gives us the ability to complete the cycle that brings insights from the bed back to the bench in support of patient-centered drug development and patient-centered care. Finally, what's AMCP doing in this space? To this end, AMCP is leading change on important issues in managed care, such as this one. One of the things we do is host live hands-on partnership forums that bring together key decision makers in managed care, integrated care, and the pharmaceutical industry, among others, to find and develop recommendations and solutions. On the issue of real-world evidence and coverage decisions, we'll be hosting a forum in March at our annual meeting on principles for sound P&T practices. During the forum, participants will identify how P&T committees are evaluating different types of evidence and what role exists for additional types of information such as real-world evidence and patient-reported outcomes. The forum will provide a venue to consider P&T practices that reflect the current and evolving healthcare system, and what recommendations are necessary to keep pace with new models of care. On the issue of data availability and integration, last year we held a forum on managing total cost of care through medical and pharmacy data integration. At that forum, participants developed a roadmap for data integration. It is a guide for managed care organizations interested in managing the cost of care and outcomes across medical and pharmacy benefits. If you're interested in developing data sets for value-based contracts or using integrated data sets to improve clinical quality, the roadmap's for you. That roadmap, though, is scheduled to be published in the Journal of Managed Care Pharmacy later this year, and we'll hold a webinar on it in May. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks, and I'll hand it back to Jen.
Great, thanks, Tricia Lee. So payers are a major stakeholder for industry that's developing evidence to help inform patient care. So Brandy, can you talk a little bit about how Eli Lilly and Company is thinking about real-world evidence and how you're using it to help address some of those key issues that Tricia Lee just spoke about?
Thank you, Jen. I'd like to thank NPC for the opportunity to share my perspective as an industry representative on how the FDA's framework for the RWE program will affect our approach to developing real-world evidence to support healthcare decisions. Industry uses RWE from early discovery to patent expiration. RWE is an important tool that helps us speed development of life-changing medicines. We routinely use RWE to gain insights to unmet healthcare needs and to understand the patient population and epidemiology of the disease. We are also working to leverage RWE in early phases of drug discovery to assess the association of drug targets and clinical outcomes. During later phases of development, RWE is used to gain patient insights to what is important to them in their treatments and their health. After approval, RWE plays an essential role in evaluating the safety profile of our products in patients that have more diverse characteristics than those in the clinical trials. Finally, RWE provides essential information for industry to continue to assess and communicate the safety, effectiveness, and value of our products as new treatment options become available. We have not unleashed the full potential for RWE in healthcare. Much more can be done within the healthcare system, and these solutions include the pharmaceutical industry to improve patients' lives and decrease costs. This is a slide used by the FDA to demonstrate their perspective of how real-world data and real-world evidence can be used in clinical studies. There are a variety of possibilities, including supporting more efficient trial execution by informing clinical trial enrollment and timeline predictions, or incorporating real-world data sources into clinical trial data collection plans. Pragmatic clinical trial designs may leverage real-world data sources and rely on real-world analytic methods to control biases that result from allowing greater flexibility in investigator treatment decisions after randomization. Finally, observational study designs and real-world analytic methods can be applied to real-world data sources to provide evidence on drug utilization, safety, effectiveness, and health economic outcomes of treatments. As with any scientific approach, the use of real-world data and real-world evidence methods across the clinical study paradigm has strengths and limitations and must be taken into account in the interpretations of the results. Lilly's goal is to make life better for people around the world. We realize the potential of RWE and hold steadfast to our brand of being reliable and caring. As such, people we are serving are at the center of our approach. We rely on deep specialized expertise in real-world data and observational study methods to provide reliable results with an explanation of the strengths and limitations of that evidence as it is applied to the specific question. Many groups have outlined best practices for the ethical and scientific concepts related to real-world data, design, and analysis. Industry's challenge is that although these standards have similarities, there is not a commonly accepted set of expectations among our stakeholders. Given the need to create RWE that is fit for purpose across a spectrum of stakeholders and decisions, the lack of established guardrails for transforming real-world data to meaningful evidence requires each project to be customized. This makes it difficult to develop efficient processes, reuse evidence, and at times deters investment in broadening use of RWE due to uncertainty in acceptance of the evidence. The issues addressed in the FDA's framework are consistent with those industry faces across the spectrum of how we apply real-world evidence. The design of many RWE studies does not always include randomization, making it challenging to clearly associate cause and effect of a health intervention. Because most real-world data is not generated for the purpose of research, it is often necessary to merge data from multiple sources to form a research-ready data set. This introduces variability in the collection, meaning, and completeness of data. These complexities of aggregating and transform the data sources require deep clinical and data science expertise to uphold the accuracy and validity of the data. Finally, because data is widely available and there are multiple design and analytic approaches that each have strengths and limitations, it is critical to be transparent in the details of how the data was transformed and analyzed to produce the real-world evidence, so that stakeholders can assess the strengths and limitations of that evidence in applying the results to the decisions. Industry has been working with a diverse group of stakeholders to increase the impact of RWE in healthcare decisions. Technology enables high velocity, volume, variety, and veracity of data, as well as unprecedented computing power. However, it is in the context of the data collection and application of the evidence in different decisions that determines the value of the evidence for each decision maker. The healthcare system is complex, and every patient has unique characteristics and experiences with their treatment. Unlocking the value of patient data requires specialized expertise in healthcare delivery, patient experience, drug development, scientific methods, public health, access reimbursement, and health policy topics. Now more than ever, stakeholders need to take a multidisciplinary approach with a focus on a common goal of developing actionable RWE to help make people's lives better. With advancing technology and increasing speed, volume, and types of data, real-world evidence is a very important tool to generate evidence to support healthcare decisions that improve people's lives. It is easy to get distracted by the diversity of data sources, designs, analytic methods, and new technology solutions. Without a clear focus, we cannot progress the foundational understanding of how RWE fits within the decision maker's framework. At Lilly, RWE starts with a question, and data and analytics are assessed for the optimal combination to best meet the information or evidence gap the stakeholder has identified. This process has served us well in advancing our ability to provide useful evidence along with clear strengths and limitations of the evidence from the context of the decision. In taking this approach, we can share the limitations in a learning cycle and strive to minimize the impact of these limitations as we develop evidence to support similar stakeholder questions. We must learn by understanding the commonalities of our approach and consistently assessing how the differences impact the results. This can only be done with a focus on a specific set of questions and a framework on which we take common approaches for developing RWE. Thank you for the opportunity to share my experience and recommendations for achieving greater impact of RWE for patients in the healthcare system.
Great. Thanks so much, Brandy. Now, we have a series of questions that have been coming in fast and furious. One of the things that I heard is that there's some challenges to using RWE. That there's some data, what are the sources, authentic data sources, etc. So I'd like to hear from each of the panelists quickly. We'll do a little bit of speed round Q&A. What's the biggest challenge? Is it the data, having the right sources and interoperable data? Is it analytics? Is it infrastructure, resources, and time? Is it cultural issues? Let's start with Eleanor, from your perspective, and we'll just go straight through the panel.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Jen. I think that there are a number of barriers. I think in general, we have cultural issues. You know, we have had in the past a negative attitude about how observational and real-world types of evidence get used, and so we've partially overcome that, but I'm not sure that we're fully there yet. So I do think we have some cultural. In terms of the patient perspective, as I mentioned, the barriers for them are twofold. One is being engaged in the types of research in the first place, and that is beginning to happen, but so far we've made greater strides in the clinical trial area than we have in the real-world evidence area, but I think it's inevitable that that will start to change. And then the second part of it is this idea of how the patient groups and individual patients will be able to understand and use this kind of information. And the barrier there is just making sure that there will be the right kinds of language used, the right kinds of documents used, that it's geared toward a patient audience, and that patients are actually involved in helping to create the information and the tools that go out to a patient audience to help them use it to make decisions about themselves and their families.
Trisha Lee?
Very quickly, I'll say it's the quality and lack of standards. So some of the valuable information that's in an EHR might be unstructured. It could be in a notes, or it could be a description entered by a clinician. And in those cases, it's hard to capture that information in a way that you can analyze easily. And so whereas the information exists, some of it's just hard to get to when it's unstructured, or if you are concerned about the quality of those that might be recording the information in their different settings of care.
Brandy, you've dealt with a lot of cultural, bringing people together to address what are common definitions and data standards. What's your perspective?
I think for us, it's been about persistency and executing against the same strategy. We've had that same strategy for over 4 years, and it's been successful for attacking and advancing all aspects of understanding real-world data, real-world design analytics, technology, and knowledge management. By starting with a question that can be reasonably addressed or informed by RWE, we have invested very specialized expertise in clinical data, data flow, observational study design, real-world analytic methods, and supported these capabilities with a thoughtful technology infrastructure and learning cycle of knowledge management. Our ability to be transparent in our approach explains the strengths and limitations of applying RWE results in context of the decision and continuously learn and adapt has led to our success in increasing acceptance and value of RWE at Lilly. So I would say it's been more focused on the whole system rather than trying to break down one certain barrier. We're trying to attack how RWE can help address particular healthcare questions.
There's a series of other questions coming in about examples of label changes. We mentioned both expansion of information as well as inclusion of real-world evidence in the clinical trials section to help understand long-term efficacy. But again, efficacy claims have been quite rare to date, and so we're looking forward to seeing how that might evolve. Let me come to one of the other questions that we have here, which is about real-world evidence is one program. We heard earlier that FDA has a new digital initiative. Are there other things that this real-world evidence program might interact with? Eleanor, patient-focused drug development or value-based contracts from Tricia Lee, from your perspective? And then we'll close with one last question.
I think it's inevitable, Jen, that this is going to overlap with patient-focused drug development. I think fundamentally, patient-focused drug development, it like anything else, should begin with patient engagement so that you fully understand the patient's experience with their illness and with the treatments that they've had. Once you have that clear understanding from the patient perspective about what's important to them, what's affecting their life, what the issues are, then you can begin to develop a clinical development plan. You can begin to think about what the components of research need to be able to address the information, the targets that you've gotten out of that conversation. So patient engagement has to be that foundation that any research plan, including clinical trials and other studies, gets built on.
We agree with what Eleanor just said. I think, being able to use real-world evidence is going to go hand in hand with FDA's plans for patient-centered drug development. It remains to see how that happens consistently, but I think that the two have to go together.
Brandy, any other things? You also work on a global scale. Are there things that are going on outside of the U.S. that the FDA program might interact with?
Yes, Jen. There is quite a large initiative coming out of Europe through their innovative medicines initiative, in which healthcare providers, academia, industry, regulators, HTA bodies are working together to continuously solve issues about how real-world evidence, particularly in their Get Real program, can be further cultivated and used. So there's a lot of initiatives about interoperability and data networks and trying to understand the strengths and limitations of linking data sources together. There are initiatives focused on certain disease states to make an environment that is more conducive to capturing important real-world endpoints into the healthcare flow, and then also scientific methods that are being addressed both scientifically as far as analytics, and then design such as pragmatic clinical trials and talking about the operational challenges. And I think there's a lot to learn from those pieces of work that are being conducted and released by the IMI initiative, Get Real.
Great. So my last question for the panelists, the title of this webinar was Let's Get Real. How will the FDA framework for RWE impact you? I think we've heard through your comments, but if you don't mind, what we'd like to understand, is it more hope and hype? Do you think it will be gradual change? Or do you expect that there will be little change that occurs? Just go quickly down the line.
Sure. I think we're full of a lot of hope, and I think maybe there might be a small amount of hype there in terms of getting enthusiasm and attention for the initiative, but I think there's quite a lot of hope. With what we have seen happen in the last just 3 to 4 years alone with patient-focused drug development and the FDA initiative, and what's happened that went from a small project on voice of the patient reports to fully the development of guidance documents, we're going to see that happen with this also, and it's not that far off.
Tricia Lee?
I agree. I think that this is an incremental step in the right direction. We have to start by evaluating what's available and thinking about how we can incorporate it. There'll be a lot of work to do as far as considering the quality of the data that's available to us. And we really didn't get to touch on anything around, wearables or patient-generated data that could also be included in or incorporated into real-world evidence. So it's a step in the right direction, but I think that it'll take some more time for us to get to where we need to be.
Brandy, you get the last word.
Sure. I think it's all a matter of perspective. I actually think we are in the midst of a very disruptive change right now. If you look back in history to look at other disruptive changes, you'll see that disruptions take time. For example, when Wikipedia launched in 2001, nobody would predict it would take out the Encyclopedia Britannica. But it took more than 11 years to accomplish. So disrupting doesn't happen after 1 month or so. It takes years and sometimes decades to take hold. If you look back in healthcare, it was in 1990 that the Human Genome Project began. Today, we're able to regularly test genetic markers to inform treatment decisions. And at the time, you wouldn't think that that would be a disruptive, that we were making progress as fast as we thought as we look back in 1990 when we were doing the Genome Project. I think we're experiencing something similar here with RWE. It's part of a broader trend of using disruptive technology to assist human decision making. I think it's just harder to see because we're in the midst of the change and not looking back on it.
Great. Well, what I'm hearing is that there's lots of hope, maybe a little bit of hype, but a lot of work for us to roll our sleeves up and work across all of the stakeholders. Please join me in thanking our panelists today, and thank you for your time. Thank you, and have a marvelous day.